Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Factory Must Grow, episode 28. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. It's a chilly day here for me in Indiana. Snow is on the ground outside, but I'll make do with some nice hot coffee. Today on the cast, we'll start with another mod spotlight as usual, and then we'll move into our main discussion, which is about why Factorio is such a darn addicting game. But first, I want to thank the show's patrons. This show is possible because of you, the listeners. If you'd like to support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/Krydax, and you'll see different options there. I always send a thank you note and a welcome message to everybody that joins, and just, let me know if the podcast is why you're supporting, because it's always interesting to me. I kind of combine the Patreon for my YouTube channel and Twitch stuff as well as the podcast. So let me know if you're supporting because of the podcast, because that'll help me know kind of, why you're here. So for today's mod spotlight, I wanted to highlight a very new mod that is actually really exciting to me. It's called Quick Ride, and it's created by Putinator, who is someone who's actually been following along my Pi series that I've been doing on YouTube. Whoever's been following that series will know that you don't get easy. First of all, your base in Pyanodons gets really huge. So you need to move around a lot, and sometimes you need to go to an ore patch that's really far away, and you don't have trains yet because trains are actually fairly far into Pi. And so all you can do is hop in a car. And what's annoying about the car in Factorio is that it's a lot of steps to get in the car and a lot of steps to get out of the car. Now, you might just say to yourself, what do you mean it's a lot of steps? You just hit the enter button. And that's true if you don't pick up the car and put it back down each time that you get in and out of it. But the problem is then that the car gets left wherever you got out of it, and that might not be where you want to get back into it, right? And so it's like, obviously it makes sense from a realism perspective that you have to park your car somewhere and then go back to where the car is. But from a gameplay perspective, it's actually not that useful, because in this game, you could just carry around 15 different cars and have them all over the place, but that's just kind of cumbersome and bulky. So anyway, I was saying to my viewers, I was like, wouldn't this be wonderful if it just worked like mounts in a lot of RPG video games, where you literally just hit a hotkey and it just summons your mount, and you're on the car now. You're in the car, and then you get out of the car. Now you're just out of the car, but like it's waiting for you for when you want to get back into it. So it basically automatically summons the car and gets into it with one key press. And then the same key press would unsummon the car, get out of it, and it would go back into your inventory. And lo and behold, Putinator made it happen. It's called Quick Ride. He's already come out with an update or two to make it work a little better with some things, but basically you just hit the enter. I mean, I re-changed the hotkey to be the enter key because that's just what I used anyway. And now I can just hit the enter key, hop in a car, hit the enter key, hop out of the car. It's so nice. It just goes right back in your inventory. It even places the car in the direction that you're walking. Though it is kind of funny because if you're walking like down, you're holding the S key on the keyboard, and then if you hit enter, well, now you're in the car and it's facing down, but now the S key is going to drive you backwards. So you do have to kind of always remember when you hop in the car, you have to switch to W, no matter what direction you were walking, but that's more the vehicle's fault. But anyway, yeah, give it a try. Go download Quick Ride. Super useful. It's just one of those things where once you're using it, you're like, yeah, this is nice. This is how it should work. Obviously, a lot of people get joy out of building garages for their tanks and cars and stuff in Factorio. So, it's not for everybody, but for me, I just wanted one car and wanted to be able to get in and out of it easily, and Quick Ride does the trick. So I do recommend it. Now, on to the main topic. Why is Factorio so addicting? Because we all agree it is. Even the terms of service of the game agrees that it is. It says, I meant to have this quote on hand, and I forgot to copy it down. Shoot. Where did it? I'm gonna see if I can find it real quick on Google, because it's so, yeah. They say, in the nature of the game, in the end user license agreement of Factorio, Especially, we are not responsible if you stay awake all night long playing Factorio and can't go to school/work in the morning, smiley face. That's in their end user license agreement. And I love it. I love that so much. And I think it's hilarious. Like, they knew when they made this game, you know, what they were doing. They knew what monster they had created. So before we get into all this, though, I do want to clarify something. When we talk about addiction, the word addiction here, for this conversation's purposes and for this podcast episode's purposes, I'm purely speaking about the informal definition, which is described as being enthusiastically devoted to a particular thing or activity. I'm not actually talking about like a clinical addiction, which in the extreme form is like a sickness that is going to massively impact your life in negative ways. That is a serious thing, and video games are things that have gotten plenty of people like clinically addicted to them, which has harmed their life, right? It's either harmed their family, their marriage, their health, because they forget to eat or sleep in a way that's not just like, oh, I went to bed late, but it's like, no, I literally like got 2 hours of sleep for multiple nights in a row instead, you know, that sort of thing. So if you know anyone or you yourself are that level of addicted to video games or Factorio, that is not healthy. I'm not encouraging that. I don't want to encourage that. That's something you need to go talk to somebody about. And you need to find some help for. And there is help out there. There is hope if that's where you're at. You certainly can get help. There is help out there. But that's not the type of addiction we're talking about in this episode. We're talking about, as you know, as people who are not in that level of addiction, but there's this amount of, you do want to play until 3 a.m. instead of midnight, or, you know, you're playing and you tell yourself, my plan is to play for 2 or 3 hours, and then I'll go to the gym, and then I'll go do that errand I had to do, you know, shopping at the grocery store. And then instead you find you've played Factorio for 6 hours and you didn't do any of those things. Those are the more informal types of addictions that we're talking about here. And that happens with Factorio and many other things that we love to do in life. But Factorio in particular seems to really hit people in that place. And it's colloquially, I can't seem to say that word, colloquially known, there we go, as Cracktorio because of this. It's such a, I feel like I've said that word before. It sounds like I've never said it in my life. Anyway, I wanted to start with kind of asking ourselves, what makes a good addicting game? Like what are the components? And I think, you know, there's a huge list, and this by no means is an exhaustive list, but I wanted to kind of talk about some of the main ones. And I also want to identify, this is not necessarily the same list as what makes a good game. Addicting games aren't necessarily good games, and good games aren't necessarily addicting, right? There's a lot of overlap because you guys get what I'm saying. So addicting games need dopamine hits, right? Like, that's one of the main reasons we get sucked into these games and we don't want to stop, is because we keep getting dopamine hits. So they need to be happening, and they need to be happening somewhat regularly. And that can come from a variety of gameplay elements, right? It could be because you finished a challenge. It could be because you beat a hard boss. It could be because, you know, you finally finished, getting that assembly line automated, right? It can be a lot of things, but it needs to have dopamine hits somewhere in the gameplay. I would argue that they need to make you feel like if you play a bit longer, you can get another hit, right? There are games like I would argue Dark Souls is a fairly addicting game, or Elden Ring, or, you know, any of those types of games. But when you finally beat a big boss, that actually does feel like a good time to stop. When you finally beat a big boss, you're like, okay, I did the thing. I finally got this huge mountain conquered. And now I have this whole new world in front of me. And this feels like a good stopping point. It doesn't feel like you're going to get another one of those huge dopamine hits in the next 20 minutes or in the next 30 minutes or even in the next hour or two, right? You know that there's now kind of a new cycle of like exploring a new area, fighting the weak enemies, figuring out what's going on. And like, that's all fun. That's all part of the gameplay loop. But it doesn't feel like you're going to get that huge reward anytime soon. So there is kind of a good stopping point. So what I'm getting at here is like an addicting game kind of needs to not have a good stopping point. There needs to be this cycle that is either short enough or kind of there's overlapping cycles of dopamine hits so that like you're always getting one even if you're on the off cycle of the other one. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of about like how far away is my next thing that I really want. And if it's always close, it's really hard to stop playing. Another thing, and this is more of a negative than a positive, and by that I mean what it needs to not be to be addicting. And I would argue that addicting games need to not be annoying. And by that I mean like if you're constantly frustrated or there's constantly things that are happening that make you want to quit, you know, you think about like classic like Halo or Call of Duty or whatever, and you get no scoped by some noob 6-year-old from across the map, and that just, you know, you're like, okay, why am I playing this game, right? And the more you feel that, the less the game is going to be an addicting game. Granted, we all have some love-hate relationships with certain games, and you know, you see the classic Steam review, 2,000 hours played, but it's a negative review and they're like, would not recommend. You're like, why do you have 2,000 hours in it then? and so there certainly are games that are addicting yet make you frustrated, but it's because they have all these other elements. I don't think that being frustrated at the game is actually part of the addiction. Most people are not actually masochists for real. We talk about it as a joke, especially with Pyanodons, but most people, like, they do it because it's actually fun, not because it's actually painful. So another element, addicting games have good challenges and high skill ceilings. I think that having that sense of there's always more out there, right? If you've played a game and after a few hours you feel like you've done all there is to do, it's probably not going to be a very addicting game. And finally, or sorry, two more. Addicting games can have random elements and gambling vibes. I don't think they have to, right? Again, these are just elements that can make an addicting game, but like obviously loot boxes are known to be very addicting. You know, when like roguelikes tend to be addicting partially because of the randomness of each run. You're like, ooh, if I do another run, I might get this item and the item that pairs really well with it, and then that will be the god run, and then I'll, you know, be able to go further than I've ever gone before. And like that, the potential of that is very attractive to us. But I do want to note, this is a side note on the gambling randomness point. I actually don't consider the new quality mechanic in Factorio to count as this type of thing. Yes, it is true the quality mechanic has some randomness, and specifically when you're like rolling for a rare, you know, power armor, there's a little bit of that gambling feel, but I don't think that the randomness itself is the driving force of what makes that mechanic fun and interesting. I think it's more just what it looks like to set it all up and stuff, because in most cases you are actually automating it to the point where the randomness cancels out over a period of time. Every once in a while, yes, you're putting in 10 ingredients and you're just hoping you get a high roll in that 10, and that is a little bit of gambling, but for the most part, the quality mechanic I don't actually think is really gambling. And finally, I think addicting games have or can have, again, they don't all have this, but they have these cyclical natures where there's kind of two different forms of gameplay. So a game that fits this bill really well that I've been playing right now is XCOM, or any of those squad-based tactics games where there's like a strategic layer in between battles where you're like equipping your squad, researching new things, figuring out plans for that. And then you have the tactical layer where you're actually like doing the turn-based combat with your squad. It's almost like two different games, and they're paired together. And obviously each one is part of a greater whole of the game that you're playing. And so there's this cyclical nature that flows back and forth, and that can be really addicting because you never feel like you want to stop, right? You want to do the strategic layer to support the tactical layer, and then you want to do the tactical layer to get back to the strategic layer that you were doing. And so it feels like you have to do this other thing first to get back to the thing you were doing, and it just keeps looping, right? And so there's a lot of games that have these types of elements as well. In Factorio, and we'll get into this, I don't think Factorio is hugely into this, but the combat in particular can feel like this, where it's like, oh, I go deal with biters for half an hour and clear out the pollution cloud, and then I go back to building the factory. Or I go build walls for a while and turrets for a while, and I expand, to this new ore patch, and then I go back to building the factory. It can feel, it's still technically the same game, right? It's not like you're actually playing a different sort of game, but the things you're actually doing when you're focusing on biters tend to be very different. So it can sort of fit that. Anyway, let's talk about now kind of how Factorio fits into all this. Why is Factorio addicting? We've talked about kind of what makes an addicting game, or what can make an addicting game. And I'll start with the negative end again of like, what's wrong with Factorio in terms of addictiveness, and why isn't it addicting? And then we'll go to the positive things after. There's only a few reasons, that being said, why I've seen people quit Factorio. And by quit, I don't mean like you quit playing it forever or like you're done for months. I just mean like, I'm playing on a Saturday, I have 6 hours that I could play, but I actually only play for 1 or 2, and I end up quitting and not wanting to play. And there's only a few reasons why I've seen people do this and talk about doing this on, the Reddit and Discord and stuff. I've been in the Factorio community for many years. I read the Reddit pretty frequently. I read the Discord a lot. So it's not like I know all of the things, but I think I have a decent handle on kind of the Factorio community as a whole. I watch some content about it. Like, I make content about it, right? So I've been around for a while, and I don't see a lot of people talking about doing this because I don't think a lot of people do. But there are a few reasons, and I'll list them out here. Reason one that I know of is that you just get overwhelmed, and I've experienced this one too. One of the more popular posts about people quitting a run or quitting for the day or things like that is in vanilla Factorio. This was before Space Age. They get to oil, and oil processing is complicated, and you've got all these pipes going everywhere, and you've got 3 different products. And for a long time in Factorio's history, there was no basic oil processing that only made petroleum gas. By the way, that's a fairly recent change in the development of Factorio's history. For a long time, as soon as you got to oil, you did have to deal with petroleum, light oil, and heavy oil, all 3 at the beginning, to even get blue science going. And so it was a more recent change, like just a couple years ago, that they switched that. And so there would be posts pretty frequently of people talking about like, does anyone else always restart when they get to oil? Or, it's like, I wanted to play today, but then I got to oil and I just had to turn the game off. And it's because you get overwhelmed, right? When you're too overwhelmed with all of the things that you feel like have to get done, and your brain doesn't have a good handle on how they're going to get done or what path you're going to take to get them done, then it feels like that dopamine hit. The future promise of dopamine is now not in your sights, right? It's not in your like, this can happen to me soon type of feeling. It's like, oh yeah, I mean, technically I'm sure it would feel good to get this blue science done, but I don't really know when that's going to happen, and I don't really know how that's going to happen. And so now I have no hope. Like the future promise of dopamine is gone, and so the fun stops, and you just feel overwhelmed and quit. And that happens with mod packs too. When people get a mod pack for the first time, a lot of people will bounce off of mod packs because it can be really overwhelming. I do think there are some strategies to help with that, but that's kind of besides the point that it happens. And it is true that it happens, and many people talk about it happening. And that's reason number one that I think people sometimes, aren't addicted in the moment to Factorio. Reason number two is just that you're tired. I think Factorio, compared to a lot of games out there, is more brain work than other games. And so if you're just actually tired physically or mentally, you had a long day at work or, things like that, I don't think it's a game that you can easily play on low brain power. And so that can be a reason that you bounce off of Factorio, or it doesn't hook you for multiple hours, is you're just exhausted. And then finally, there's burnout, which is more the type of like actually quitting for months that I'm talking about. Sometimes you've just played too much, or your interest in the game has dwindled a little bit. But either way, your desire to move forward just isn't strong enough to drive you through the, doing the brain work and doing all the steps that it takes to get further, and I don't know exactly how that all works physiologically. Like, I don't know if the dopamine actually gets smaller when we're less interested in something, or if, I don't know if it's a chicken or egg situation, like which thing drives the other thing. But I do know they go together. And if you're hitting burnout, then Factorio stops feeling like an addicting game. Now, those are the kind of the negative pieces. Those are out of the way. But when those aren't happening, Factorio tends to be Cracktorio. Like, we cannot stop playing this game. And particularly, late nights are just commonly talked about with Factorio, you know, is like you can't go to bed, you know. People, I see a Reddit post at least once a week, I feel like, of like, how do you stop playing Factorio? And then, you know, someone comes into the comments and has the classic suggestion of set a timer and just stick to it. And to be fair, that is actually one of the best suggestions. It's still hard to stick to, though. You need willpower to tear yourself away from the factory. So let's get into, and this is not in a particular order. I didn't have time to like make this into a thesis, you know what I mean? So you may not agree with all of these, and you may have some others that you feel are there. So please let me know in the comments. But this is my list, and I also asked the Discord, the Krydania Discord, kind of what they find addicting about Factorio, and so I kind of put those things together with some of the things that I'd been thinking, and I kind of have this list now of like, why is Factorio so addicting? So reason number one, and I realize now that I didn't number these, I bullet pointed these. Can I change that? Yes, I can. Much better. Okay, reason number one, the tech tree is a form of constant external motivation. And I also haven't gotten into external versus internal motivation. I'm probably not going to go super deep on that. In brief format, external motivation is goals in the game that exist from the game's side of things. So like the tech tree, you have to get more items and ingredients and recipes done to progress through the tech tree. It forces to play the game, you have to do more stuff. Whereas internal motivation or intrinsic motivation would be like, I want to get 1,000 SPM. There's no gameplay reason to get 1,000 SPM. Like, it doesn't exist. The game doesn't reward you in any specific way for getting 1,000 SPM. That is purely an internal goal. So and this is a discussion that we've had about the game, but some people are more extrinsically motivated. Some people are fine with the intrinsic motivations. They tend to do better in sandbox games like Minecraft and Factorio because you can set those goals for yourself. The people that have played vanilla for 7,000 hours have to have some form of internal motivation because there's not enough to do in vanilla externally. You know, the tech tree is not that big. It's bigger now with Space Age. I'm thinking pre-Space Age here. There just wasn't enough to do. You launch a rocket, you can do some more sciences, you can make some cool stuff, but you're never going to play for 7,000 hours if you're not good at motivating yourself to do big new things like mega basing. So anyway, the tech tree, though, is a form of external motivation that's constantly there driving you to do the next thing, right? It gives the promise of new fancy recipes and technologies, maybe weaponry to fight the biters, and all the stuff in Factorio is very cool feeling. Like, most of the tech nodes are exciting in some way. And so because of how Factorio works, you're like, ooh, if I get that next tech node, then I'll have this new technology that can allow me to do this other thing better, or it can allow me to do this new thing that I haven't gotten to do yet, like long inserters or whatever it is. So that's constantly in front of you. Also, there is the cyclical nature of factory growth. So this is number two. You make stuff, and then the stuff works. But then that stuff working gets you more stuff. And that more stuff is often different stuff than what you already had. So now there's something you need to do with that different stuff, which then goes into making more stuff. And then that more stuff is different stuff. And then you need to put that stuff. So it's just this constant, like, you make a thing and then you work on, what do I do with that thing? I move it to a new place. So there's this cycle of creation, and like, you do the creation of the factory, but then the factory does creation of things. And then you get to kind of reap the benefits of that. And then you connect up that thing to the next thing. So it is this kind of, again, earlier I was talking about like a cyclical nature of like a squad-based game with tactical and strategic layers being separate, but Factorio has some of that, you know, ebb and flow of you're actually working on a production line and creating that, but then the production line is now producing and you're kind of handling that output now. So it's kind of like, am I working on creating a bunch of inputs and production processes, or am I working on handling outputs? And that is kind of a natural ebb and flow to the Factorio game. Number three, the automation is just incredibly satisfying. Watching your factory run is beautiful. And I think often I forget to do this because I'm so, nose to the grindstone for the next thing. But just sitting back and watching the factory run is really cool. Like the graphical feedback of the game, watching the items on conveyor belts. Imagine if the game just had item tubes and you couldn't see the items moving. It would be such a different game. Just that mere fact alone that the items are physically present with graphics on the conveyor belts, and you can see, it's a form of visual feedback on how many items you have. The items look cool, the art is good. Like, it's just addicting to watch. And there's this level of accomplishment and pleasure that we get in looking at what we've built. Right? When you were a kid, I hope you all played with Legos, because if you didn't, I'm sad. Not to say that everybody has to love Legos. It's fine if you don't like Legos, but Legos are great, I thought. And when you're a kid and you finish that Lego set, or even when you're an adult and you finish that Lego set, there's this feeling of accomplishment. Like, I built that. I just had a pile of pieces and I put them together. I may have followed instructions, sure, but I put them together and now it looks like this and it's awesome and I like to look at it and it's cool and now I can play with it if, that's something anyway, like there's this feeling of I built that shows up in Factorio when you kind of zoom out and you're like, oh my gosh, I built this. Like, I placed every piece in this factory and it's all working together. Usually, sometimes it's not working, but it's all working together to do these insane things, like combining hundreds of ingredients. And there's this level to which Factorio, more so than most games, really gives you a view of what you've done. Like it helps you grasp the volume of work that you've put in. Other games, you think back to like the Dark Souls type games I was talking about before. You can put in hundreds of hours, and what do you actually get out of it? If you were dying and not gaining souls the whole time and leveling up your character, you literally might have gained nothing except experience. And sure, that is its own form of reward. I love those games because of the experience being part of what you're actually learning how to do. Like, you're earning actual knowledge in your brain for how to play the game. But that's very different. And it doesn't have the same dopamine levels that Factorio does when you look at your base and you're like, oh my God, every minute I've spent placing things has all accumulated into this massive infrastructure that's producing thousands of, different items in different places. And trains are flying everywhere and bots are flying everywhere. And it's all just working to make, maybe it is 1,000 science per minute. Like, that is crazy, and that just feels so good. So that's a huge part of why the game is addicting, is it's incredibly rewarding. Both to watch, it's incredibly rewarding to just watch it run, but it's also just rewarding in the sense of the grand total of your gameplay is rewarding. Point number 4 I have here. The progression curve is extremely satisfying. You start out with nothing, right? Like you start with, you're in a cave with a box of scraps trying to build the Iron Man suit, right? You've got your pickaxe and you're hitting rocks, right? But very quickly, you're already into the burner stage where like you've got burner miners that are now placing ore into furnaces for you. And now you're just having to shuttle around the coal. And then not too far after that, now things are on belts and inserters are putting things in and out, but you're still doing some more manual work. And before too long, again, thinking the vanilla game here, before too long, your base is now fully automated. And that progression is really rewarding. But now most of the game is still ahead of you, right? You can get to full automation pretty quick. But now you've got the progression of, getting entirely new gameplay elements like oil and fluids going. And then you need to deal with more power. And then, once you've got oil going, now you need to deal with multiple outputs. And even just like long inserters showing up, there's just constantly something ahead of you that's really cool. And Space Age has made this even more enticing. I think Space Age has a lot more interesting content that's kind of constantly dangling right in front of you. Now it's like, oh, now I can go to a new planet soon. And which planet do I want to go to? And that's a whole choice. And they all seem enticing. And so, yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff there. So yeah, the progression curve, very satisfying, even more so with Space Age, I think. Point number 5, the game is challenging. it's not easy. I don't think anybody would say Factorio is just an easy game that plays itself, right? Like, you have to put in the work of figuring out, what do I want to place? Where do I want to place it? You know, if I am going to use bots, how many am I going to use? How am I going to make the network? If I'm going to use trains, how am I going to do that? Like, the game is, it is work. And I think that adds to the rewardingness. It is also part of that negative point I made earlier about it's a hard game to play when you're tired. But I think that also comes with this benefit of, that's because it's kind of work, and work is meaningful, or at least it feels meaningful. I don't know how much meaning there is in playing Factorio. You know, beyond entertainment, I think it's a bit educational, and it's good practice for like brain organization of stuff. But that being said, because it's harder to do than just, you know, I'm trying to think of a really easy game, or, you know, a brain off game. I don't know. I tend to engage very, very heavily brain-wise with games that I play, so I don't know a ton of games that are like, what's that game that people play on their phones? I can't even think of what it's called, where you match things together. Candy Crush. You know, that kind of game. I don't think many people would argue that like Candy Crush is hard and Factorio is easy, right? It's very much the opposite. So I think that's part of why Factorio is addicting, is because it's challenging enough, it's enough work that it feels rewarding when you actually do it. All right, need a little bit more coffee here, sorry. All right, point number 6, and this is one that many people have said. Almost everybody says this about the game. There's always just one more thing to do. Always. It doesn't ever feel like your to-do list is empty. You know how I was talking about, you know, the Dark Souls games, when you beat a boss, it kind of feels like, finally my to-do list is cleared, and like, now I don't really have a direct next step. Like, I know there's more to do, but like, this is a good stopping point. Yeah, Factorio doesn't have those, right? In Factorio, you finish one production line, and like I said, now there's but now I have these new items. Like, this is the thing I was working towards this whole time. So now is not a good stopping point, because now I have the blue science. So of course I need to hook up the blue science to my labs and research something with that blue science. But then by the time you've actually researched something with the blue science, now you're already knowing what the next thing is that you need to do, because like, oh, well, now I need to hook up the assemblers to this new thing, or now I have, you know, electric smelters and I can rebuild my entire smelting line. And so now so it never really feels like it's like, oh, I did that thing and now I can stop, because really there's nothing I need to do right now in the factory. You know, the factory is always hungry, right? The factory must grow. It's the name of this podcast because it's what, you know, it's the feel that we all get when we play the game. So the just one more thing element, you know, and the classic phrase was just one more turn for like the Civilization games, and it's very present in Factorio. And part of the reason I also think it happens is because our factories, at least with how most people play the game, most of us build top down rather than bottom up. And by that I mean, we build the blue science build even knowing we may not have quite enough iron to make it work. And then when we notice our iron's running low, we then go add more iron. Some people are constantly trying to build bottom up. Like, I'll do the iron that I need first, and then I'll do the copper, and then I'll do the green circuits, and then I'll do the engines, and then I'll do this. And then finally, like, when you finally plug everything in, you're guaranteed that it will have enough of all of its inputs. But often there's a little bit of both going on. Like, you may know you need more iron and you may set up the engines first, but like, that doesn't mean when you plug in your blue science, everything works. Often there's something that is starved, where input starved on something. And that type of to-do list item, it's not one you were even planning on, and it pops onto your to-do list. So there's always one more thing to do, partially because there's also always something going wrong with the factory, because these are large, complex, you know, monsters that we create, and usually we can't foresee how everything interacts. And because we failed to foresee something pops up that we weren't expecting, and it goes on our to-do list, and now boom, you can't quit because you got to go fix your iron. Your iron's starved, so I got to go do that. I can't quit now, right? So that's what I'm getting at with the one more thing. Thing number 7. The game is also visually and gameplay wise distinct in telling you what to do next. This is kind of related to the previous one, but I think it's a little bit of a separate point. The game is really good at telling you what to do. So it's not only that there is always a to-do list item, but it's that the game has given you feedback in a way that makes it pretty easy to know what that thing is. I mentioned this earlier regarding the graphics being cool, but when you look at your iron belt and it's empty, or there's only 2 measly plates, floating along because like something else took most of them from, and all the splitters off of the bus have taken all the iron. You're like, oh no, I know that's not enough iron for this blue science build that I just made. And so like the game visually is good at telling you don't have enough because of the belts and because of pipes maybe being empty and because of buildings not running. Right. And you're building the factory to be a running thing, not a stopped thing. And so all of the visual feedback that the game provides is kind of adding those things to your to-do list without you going and looking for them. Now, I will add a side note that this is a little bit less true with mega bases. The issues can be a little harder to hunt down. And I would also argue that Space Age makes it even harder with having your bases on different planets and all that. But at that stage, you're using other tools to diagnose your base. And, if you're a progressing factory player, you might have learned that setting up alarms to alert you when things are low. And so it's like the game even gives you tools, if you want to use them, that can also help you diagnose these things. So, yeah, I think that's a really important element to why it's addicting, is because the things that are going wrong are very visible and they're not just like under the surface. Number 8. A lot of people on Discord also talked about how good it feels to solve bottlenecks, right? And this is kind of alongside some of the other points we've made, but the bottlenecks in particular are satisfying because there's just that, it's almost like if you had a stream that was dammed up, you're walking through the forest and there's this little stream and you're like, oh no, like this log fell over and a couple sticks and twigs and pine needles got all jammed up. And there's just this feeling of like, if you were to like pick up that log and move it and move those pine needles and you could then watch it like resume like normal stream flow, you're like, that feels better. There's just that feeling of freeing up things that are meant to be moving feels really nice. And I think there's some human things, like psychological things going on there. I don't know if I fully understand it, but I think most people agree on those types of feelings, feeling really good. And obviously, if your factory has a bottleneck and you're not getting the iron, like just being able to freeing up the bottlenecks. There's always another bottleneck. The other podcast that's about factory games is called The Bottleneck Show, right? These podcasts are titled based on these ideas that we all love about factory games. And fixing bottlenecks in particular is a really good feel. And like I just talked about in the previous point, it's usually easy to spot where they are. So it's kind of, there's always another bottleneck. And so, yeah. Number 9, this is getting into a topic that I would love to spend a whole podcast talking about another time. Numbers go up. Dopamine hits from just numbers getting bigger. Why do we like numbers to get bigger? I don't know exactly. That's part of the topic of that other podcast we'll do. Is Factorio an idler game? That's the idea that I'd like to get into another time. But for now, I just want to talk about the idea of idlers or clickers or incremental games. They're kind of interchangeable terms, more or less. And they're hugely addicting games for some people. And it's purely because the numbers go up, right? Those games don't often have that much gameplay going on. It's literally about making a number get bigger. Think Cookie Clicker or Synergism or Antimatter Dimensions or those types of games. Like the numbers go up. And that's why we like them. Why? I don't know. I, in particular, am very, very into those types of games. I think it's because humans have this innate stockpiling nature. We like to hoard things. I mean, some people are literally hoarders. That's a whole thing. That's an issue, but that is a thing. But we all like to hoard lots of various things. Like, we feel better when our pantry has food in it, right? An empty pantry feels wrong because we want to stockpile food. That's just this innate, like, obviously we don't want to starve. So that, like, it makes sense, right, that humans want to stockpile things. But it's also like money and wealth, and, you know, why do people have storage units to hold all this? Like, why do we have so much stuff? We just like stuff. We like things we like to have. And whether that's, you know, for some people it's relationships and friendships and people, and other people it's money and you know, food, money, wealth, power, friendships, relationships, love, all of it. Like, we want it all, right? There's just something about us that's greedy, and we want all the things. So Factorio having, you know, the production graph is particularly what I'm thinking about right now, because you don't often see the number, you visually see the numbers go up, right? When your belt has a trickle of iron on it and then it goes to being a fully saturated iron belt, that is numbers going up, right? Like, it's a visual representation of the numbers going up, which is doubly rewarding. But then there's also just the production graph, and it's really satisfying when you go from 900 iron plates a minute to 1800 iron plates a minute, because now you have 2 belts, and you can see that on the graph, and you see the line go up, and now you've got the new number that says 1800, and that feels great. So I do think part of the Factorio addictiveness is the same as an idler / incremental game, which is just the numbers are going up. The factory is growing. We're doing more. And I think the fact that it's more is important. It's not just that we're doing something more complicated, it's that we're doing more of it. And that is its own reward as well. For whatever reason, that makes our monkey brains happy. All right, item number 10. Another factor that I think is less obvious is that the game is not linear. And there's a level of linearity to it, of course. Like, you know, to launch a rocket, everybody has to get the same ingredients for the rocket launch, right? You need to get the rocket fuel, you need to do this. So, like, everyone has to do those things. But the number of ways there are to do that task, I mean, it's quite literally infinite. But even if you ignore most of the ways to solve it that are kind of unrealistic, it's still massive, right? Like, when you look at the Reddit posts of people's bases, they all look really different. I mean, and I'm not just talking like, oh, that belt had a squiggle in it instead of made a nice right angle. I actually mean, like, literally the way they solved the problem is different. And now with Space Age, there's even more ways to differentiate solving the problems, especially with all the combinator logic that we can more easily do now. Being able to control your base with combinators, like, did you engage with that at all? Did you engage with trains at all? Did you engage with bots at all? Did you deal with spoilage in this way or that way? Because there are different ways to deal with spoilage, right? Like, there's just so many different ways to solve these problems that I think there's I know that there's an absurd amount of possibilities to play the basic game. And obviously the reason that that's addicting is because it gives you this sense that you're paving a new path. I think we as humans are explorers. Like, we all are a little bit jealous. Maybe we're not. I think we are to some level. A little bit jealous that, or not jealous, but unhappy that the world was fully mapped out when we were born, right? There's a part of us that I think wished, you know, that we could explore new lands, right? And there's something about a game that's not linear that feels that way, right? That's why Minecraft is exciting when you load into a new world that has this random seed. You're like, no one has ever seen this world before. Like, I'm exploring this thing, and it's exciting because it's not known, right? And Factorio, the map is a little bit less interesting, though technically it is unknown, but it's more what you do to build the base that's unknown. And you are going to build a base that no one has ever seen before. And you know that when you're building it. And there's something a little satisfying about that you're not just following along this rote path that other people have taken. You know, in other video games, I'm trying to think of like a more linear shooter. I don't know. Let's go back to Halo. Like Halo 2, the campaign. Right? When you play the campaign of Halo 2, It's pretty dang linear. I think there are maybe a few points where you technically could choose left or right or something, but like you're playing the same game that everyone else has played, and the things you have to do to beat that game pretty much the same as everybody else. Of course, you can, there's non-linearity in how you go about the combat with this enemy or that enemy, but the game itself is linear. Whereas Factorio, it's like, no, I could launch a rocket and my experience could be so different than yours, and you also launched a rocket. We could get to the shattered planet and have completely different experiences on how we did it. And so I just think that's really cool, and that's part of why Factorio is addicting, and it's part of what that's almost a different layer of addiction, is like, why do people keep coming back to the game? The replayability of it. This podcast episode is more about why is it addicting in the form of, I don't want to put it down tonight. But I do think this point is a big one in why can't we put it down ever? Why do people play Factorio for years? Why do people have thousands of hours in Factorio? I think this point I just made is a lot of that as well. Point number 11. There's always another layer to the onion. This is kind of what I was just talking about, I guess, now that I've talked about it. But if you want to play through to feel different, then you could try trains. If you didn't do trains in your last base, you could try a mega base. You could try doing combinator controlled stuff where you only have one bank of 50 assemblers that do all your assembling, and you just have like combinators control it all. You could build a diagonal base because you're one of those weird people. You could do a bot base because you didn't do bots before, or you could do bots because you could not do bots because you're always doing bots. That's me. You could try city blocks because you've never done a city block base. Or you could try to not do a city block base because you're hopelessly addicted to city blocks every time, right? Like, there's always another layer to this onion of Factorio. And I actually do think, back to what I was just saying about, is it actually part of why we keep playing till 3 a.m. or is it part of why the game is replayable? And I think this one's also both. Because I think part of why we play till 3 a.m. is when we're doing the path that we're doing, there's this knowledge that there are other paths too. And somehow that makes the path we're on even more exciting because we know that, like, oh, next time I kind of want to try this. And I do think that helps keep us going as well because there's this excitingness to it that it's not even like the last time we're going to do this. And I think that gives some more excitement to the actual gameplay sessions. All right, number 12. Wow, I can't... We're already getting late in the podcast, and I still have quite a few more to go. All right, number 12. The game is easy to get going. I think this is a really big piece. It would be hard for a game to be addicting if it was massively hard to get into. I think about games with huge learning curves. I haven't even played these. We were talking about them on my Discord the other day, but games like Hearts of Iron or Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis, like these big grand strategy games. And I've looked into playing them a few times, and I'm just like, I think I need to like watch 5 to 10 YouTube videos that are all over an hour long to even have a grasp on what the game is, right? Like I don't even think I understand what the game is by reading the Steam page, reading what people say about it, even watching the videos on the Steam page. Like, I don't think any of that gives me even a feel for what the game is or what I would do or what I would need to know to even start playing it. Right? Factorio is not like that. Factorio is a game where within 2 minutes of the demo or watching, the video, the little trailer video they made, you immediately understand, oh, yeah, you get ore out of the ground, you turn that into stuff, and then you turn that stuff into other stuff, and then it's the cycle of continuing to turn stuff into other stuff and put it on belts or trains, and you move that stuff over there, and then that stuff gets turned into other stuff. That's the game. Very easy to get into. And once you get into it, it rewards being better at it. It's not a game that requires you to be better at the start. I love the Reddit posts of people who are like, hey, here's my first base. What do you guys think? And you look at it and you can't help but laugh because you're like, oh, my sweet summer child. Like, you have, inserters inserting onto the same side of the belt, so like the items are mixed and that's going to get clogged up, but you don't know that yet because you've never experienced that. And there's just this feeling of like, it's awesome how much growth the game takes you on, and that's part of why it's addicting, is because you're growing when you're playing. right? Like when you first start, you don't know how it works, but you understand enough to want to try, and then you do, and then you make mistakes, and then next time you won't make those mistakes. And so I think growth is an extremely fun part of games when you know you're getting better at something. And Factorio is pretty clear to you, the player, that you are getting better at it. You know, players are often restarting because they're like, I want to take everything I learned and apply it to my next base. I'm going to leave more room between these processing lines this time, you know, and you inevitably don't. And then, you know, it takes you 5 more tries before you actually start putting into practice these lessons, if you're me. But you are learning things and you are progressing, and it does reward being smart and efficient about things, but it doesn't require them. And I think that's part of the addictiveness, because if it required them, I think a lot more people wouldn't even play it in the first place, or they'd bounce off of it, or they'd get more bored. But this game is constantly saying, hey, you can do this in a really crappy way and it will work. You can spaghetti it however you want. You can use inserters however you want. As long as it puts the items into the assembler and you give the assembler power, it's gonna work. So it does feel like even a caveman could do it, kind of. And I think that's part of the addictiveness, is that it caters to all players, right? I think there are very few people that literally just... Well, I say that. There are plenty of people who don't like Factorio because it's not the kind of game they like. But what I'm trying to say here is that if people are interested in playing the Factorio game, I don't think they're very often bouncing off of it because it's like they can't do it, right? I think most people, when they are interested in doing it, they try it and then they realize, I can do this. I did connect that belt. It is working. I have green science. It's amazing, right? And like, it just keeps giving you more that you can do. So anyway, that's point number 12. Point number 13. I had to mention this one because I do think it's pretty relevant for a lot of players, myself included, though it's not quite... It's a little bit tangential to the point of this episode of the podcast, which is modding. Modding is huge. There are so many of them, and the content mods in particular make a massive difference. So mods are huge. Of course, when you add another entire dimension to a game that's already addicting, it furthers that addiction and replayability. However, I don't think that's really an argument for why Factorio is addicting, if that makes sense. I feel like mods help with everything. They're kind of like icing on the cake, but they're not really the cake. So they don't quite fit in the scope of what I'm talking about, but I wanted to at least mention them, that like I think a lot of people stay addicted to Factorio. And for some people, mod packs have content that's more addicting because of the stuff that's in the mod pack. And so for some people, Factorio is more addicting because of mods, if that makes sense. Like some people are like, oh yeah, like I never felt that into vanilla Factorio, you know, I never felt like it was Cracktorio, but then I got C block and I was hooked. You know, I think some people experience that sort of thing. And so mods do contribute to the addictiveness of the game for some people, depending on what their experience is. But I think the argument I'm making in this podcast is that Factorio, mods or not, is an addicting experience. And then the next one that I have, point number 14, is that quality of life features. And this is a huge one. I mean, it should be higher on the list if we were ranking them by like how much they actually contribute to the addictiveness, because I think this is one of the biggest ones. Quality of life features are plentiful and well done and powerful. And not just quality of life features, but the game design around what do I actually have to do in terms of keyboard, mouse, thought process, you know, where do I have to move my eyes on the screen? What do I have to click on? How easy is it to make a factory? What does it actually take for me to do? And Factorio has put so much effort, the team, into designing a game where that is minimized. The amount of effort I have to do, whether it's clicks, whether it's keyboard inputs, whether it's like difficulty in moving my character, whatever it is, they've minimized those difficulties, except in the places where those difficulties are rewarding, right? They've thought all of those things through. If there are things that get in the way of you building a factory, they've been thought about and they've been deemed to be rewarding and helpful to be in the game. So that means all of the things that would be annoying are gone. Now, I say all, that's not quite true because, right, they can't cater to everybody. I found a lot of things, especially in Space Age, to be quite annoying, even though they're things that I think the devs intended, right? So they can't cater to everybody. That's fine. But my point is the game has had a massive amount of work put into it to make sure the friction between you and getting things done is zero, or as close to zero as it can be. And I think this is a huge part of why Factorio is addicting. When you play other factory games, they often don't hook you as much as Factorio does. I know for some people that's not true, partially because the other games also offer different experiences and they just like those experiences more. But most people agree on Factorio being the king when it comes to this concept I'm talking about, like the design of the user experience and the quality of life features and all of those pieces put together. I don't know what you call this, but like the UI UX experience overall, including the QOL stuff like blueprint, copying and pasting in the blueprint book and being able to modify blueprints in the ways that you can, like all of that put together is such a big part of why we want to keep playing, because there's no friction. And the more friction there is in the game, the more quickly you get to be like, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed playing Satisfactory, but after like 4 hours, I had to stop because I just couldn't, connect belts anymore because it's such a pain in the butt. That's how I feel, at least. Whereas in Factorio, connecting belts is super easy, barely an inconvenience. You can just copy paste an entire set of 15 belts that go 400 tiles if you want to, and now your bots place it. So like there's a level of anything, like the friction of playing the game is so reduced that it feels like you really can play for 6 hours or 10 hours or whatever, and you're not tired, and your brain's, even though your brain is maybe a little tired from all the thinking it's done, it's been so rewarded that it's like, I love this, let's keep doing it. When your train systems are just running without a hitch and all you had to do was set up a couple schedules, it just feels really nice. Other games are often not that easy. Other games often have a lot of friction between your brain thought of a thing it wanted to do and, okay, now that thing's done. A lot of games have a lot of friction between those 2 points, and Factorio has done a really good job in reducing that friction to close to zero. And I think that's a big part of why it's addicting. That being said, I do think Space Age, for this particular point, I think Space Age was a step backwards in some of these categories. I found myself feeling a lot more friction in my Space Age playthrough. There were a lot of cool things. There were a lot of great things about Space Age. I do recommend Space Age to everybody that likes Factorio. But I think in this specific category of like friction between my brain thought it and it got done, I think Space Age has a lot more of that friction, and I felt it, and I didn't love all of that. Anyway, yeah. So that being said, those are my major points. I think the game really, and I'll make point number 15. I was on the fence whether to add this or not, because again, it's like, is this really part of why it's addicting, or is it just part of, anyway, it's just the sound and visual design. I don't often focus on these when I talk about games, because for me, they've never been a focus of games. Sometimes people will talk about, oh my God, that soundtrack, like I had to buy it immediately and I listened to it every day. And I'm like, wait, there was a soundtrack? Like that's been my experience of gaming over the years. Same thing with story in games. Like story for me is fine. It's maybe a cherry on top, but it's never the main thing of a games. So games that are only good because of being a good story, like I tend to not enjoy those. And graphics, I'm just not that picky about graphics. The thing I am picky about is if things are like visually distinct, right? I don't need the graphics to look really good, but I do need them to work for the game. So that much I do care about. But most games figure out graphics that work for them, even if they're not high quality. But that being said, I do think part of why Factorio is addicting is because it looks good, it sounds good, the audio feedback when you're clicking on stuff is good. The factory's giving you this audio feedback on the assemblers running, and when a train comes to a stop, and Like the train stopping sound is really rewarding, and you see it, you know, puffing along, but then when it stops, you know, there's this like some visual effects to that. So I do think the game visually giving you these graphics that it gives you and the audio coming in to match, I think those are part of the experience that makes Factorio addicting. And if the sound design and graphics design was worse, I think less people would play Factorio for as many hours as they do, or the sessions, you know, like on average, I guess what I'm saying is if you were to this would be a crazy number. I have no idea what it would be. But if you were to take every Factorio player's average session length over all of time, and then you were to go to an alternate universe where the graphics were worse and the sound design was worse and the music was worse, I think that number would be smaller. Right? I think the average session length would be smaller. I do think these things contribute to the addictiveness of Factorio. For me, I don't think they're a huge part of it, but I think they help. So anyway, that's point number 15 and my final point. So all that being said, Factorio, to summarize, Factorio does a great job of creating itches, giving you tools to scratch those itches, and then making it extremely rewarding when you scratch them. And then it loops that on itself. And I also think it has multiple cycles of this create itch, you know, give you tools to scratch itch, and then reward you for scratching that itch. And I think those cycles overlap in a way where the high points of some cycles overlap with the low points of other cycles, which means that there's always something. There's always an itch being scratched. There's always a next itch to scratch. And there's always, I just finished scratching that itch and that was rewarding, right? There's always kind of all three of those going in these cycles. You know, the biters can be a big part of that. I do think that's why combat is part of the game, is it contributes to this cycle. As much as that is true, I still think that combat is not for everybody, right? And I don't think it's required to be part of the game, but I do think the combat contributes to the game's addictiveness from the default settings. So yeah, on top of all that, being how each run feels, there are many different axes on which you can customize each run, whether it's the game settings, your own plans for the run to do a train base or a bot base or a belt base or, you know, mega base, whatever it is, or the actual mods to modify the content of the gameplay. So that makes you want to run one more run every time. And all of that put together, I think makes Factorio one of the most addicting games I've ever had the pleasure of playing. And I know a lot of you guys agree, especially those of you that are listening to this podcast. So what about you? What do you find addicting about Factorio? Please share in the comments. If you're watching here on the YouTube VOD on Krydex Extra, that's a great place for comments, or the Krydania Discord is a great place for comments. There are links to both of those places in the description if you're just here listening to the podcast. Please join the Krydania Discord. We have a lot of fun over there. And let me know, why do you find Factorio so addicting? What did I miss? I'm sure I missed some points. I'll even say it as an honorable mention because so many other people mentioned it. I didn't really list it because I don't think it gets to the heart of the point, but a lot of people likened the game to programming, but like all the fun parts of programming. So anyone that does programming often feels like Factorio is like programming but fun. You know, it's like we took all the best parts, all the most rewarding parts. The building the code base over time is like building, you know, your interconnected trains and stuff. Like it is similar in a lot of ways, and I do support that analogy. So that's my honorable mention. But what else did I miss? Let me know. Come and tell me. And yeah, with that, we'll wrap up episode 28 of The Factory Must Grow. As always, if you'd like to support the cast, head over to patreon.com/Krydex. Thank you so much to all my patrons. The first and third Monday is when we stream the cast on Twitch. The standard time is 11 a.m. Eastern, though this one was a little bit early because I got somewhere I got to be today. And I do apologize for the last cast being missing. That was due to some life circumstance stuff, and I just figured it'd be better to just cancel rather than try to make it fit into some other things. But we will plan for, this was the third Monday, so we'll plan for the first Monday of January being the next episode. And as always, if you have any questions, ideas for topics, or ideas for guests, head over to the Krydania Discord and let me know there. I'll put a link in the description. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next time. Always remember, the factory must grow.